Germany says it will slash the number of Russia's diplomatic missions in the country. The German Foreign Ministry has revoked the licenses of 4 out of 5 Russian consulates. It says that it's up to Russia to decide which of the consulates to close. Moscow has criticized this as an unfriendly step aimed at the further destruction of bilateral ties. Berlin's move is in response to the Russian Foreign Ministry limiting the number of German officials in Russia to 350. Well, earlier, DW political correspondent Simon Young told me how these tensions began.
Well, Nicole, as you know, in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine, relations between the two countries have been worsening for a while, I think it's fair to say. But the most recent thing, as you mentioned, Russia has capped the number of German state employees that they're allowing to operate in Russia, to limiting that number to 350 people. So what's unusual about that is that that it applies not just to diplomatic staff, the embassy staff and consular officials and so on, but also to some people with more of a cultural focus, including teachers and staff at the German schools in Russia, and also people at the Goethe Institutes, which are sort of Germany's institutes that promote interest in German language and culture. So that was a relatively unusual move that happened just recently, and this is the German response, an attempt to sort of create some kind of parity, at least in the numbers of officials who'll be working here, and that's why they've said they're going to close consulates in various places around Germany.
What are the likely consequences of these tit-for-tat moves?
Yeah, well, I think the main people to notice it are ordinary people who need to use those consulates, particularly Russian citizens in Germany who need to get paperwork. Consulates are, of course, administrative institutions, and they provide certificates of births, marriages and deaths and that kind of thing. So these are the sort of links, perhaps you might say, in some ways, the last remaining sort of links between civil societies in the two countries. And this is just going to make it harder. Not impossible, of course, because the embassy in Berlin and we understand the consulate in Bonn will remain open when these other 4 consulates are closed. So, they'll be able to continue to operate. But I think something similar may happen for German citizens, on German people, or anyone indeed who needs consular support in Russia. It'll be a little bit more difficult to obtain.
Yeah, the Russian Foreign Ministry has already announced that Germany's decision will not go unanswered. We haven't quite heard the end of this escalation, have we?
Well, indeed not. It's hard to see what exactly is the next step. Germany has sort of preempted the move by announcing on its own side that it is going to close its consulates in Kaliningrad, Yekaterinburg and Novosibirsk. So the tit-for-tat response won't be able to take the form of closing consulates, I suppose. The Germans say that they are going to keep both a diplomatic and a cultural presence in Moscow and St. Petersburg as best they can, with the reduced numbers of staff that they're allowed to have there. But certainly, I think politicians, the Kremlin on one side, German politicians here in Berlin, both saying that they think that their governments have taken the right step, and so no one's backing down tonight, at least.
Political correspondent Simon Young, thank you so much.
Let's get more from our Moscow bureau chief, Yuri Resheta, who's operating from Riga since Russian authorities closed down DW's Moscow operation. And Nina Haase is our chief political correspondent. Welcome both. Let's start with you, Nina. Why is this happening?
Well, Phil, this is the latest episode in a spiral of escalation between Germany and Russia when it comes to expelling diplomatic staff, respectively. You said it, in April, Berlin sent 30 Russians who'd been working here at the embassy back home. Essentially, the message at the time was that those people were spies and not diplomats. And to retaliate, Moscow then expelled 30 German diplomats and at the time already announced that they would put this cap on the number of German staff allowed to work in Russia. Now, this limit was communicated 4 days ago. Only 350 Germans are allowed to work in Russia now, but this limit doesn't just apply to diplomats. Russia has also included local staff, as well as teachers, kindergarten teachers, people working in language schools. So essentially, this cap targets the areas where Germans and Russians still had some sort of interaction. And that is why the German government has now heavily criticised this move and saying it was a step of escalation by the Russian government. It was unjustified. And a spokesperson said today that they had to re-establish parity when it comes to structure and staff numbers.
Yuri Reshetto, so why did Moscow limit Germany's officials as well as their diplomatic presence?
Well, as Nina said, this was the next step of an unprecedented escalation. Bilateral ties between Germany and Russia have never been this bad. It all started with the expulsion of 2 German diplomats 2 years ago. Back then, Moscow claimed that they had taken part in what it considered to be illegal protests in January 2021. At the time, thousands of Russians were arrested after taking part in nationwide protests against the Kremlin, protests called for by the opposition politician Alexei Navalny. That was at the beginning of the current downward spiral. Then in March of this year, Russia blocked accounts of the German Goethe Institute in Russia, and in April 30 Russian diplomats had to leave Germany on suspicion of espionage. And finally, at the end of last week, hundreds of German employees in Russia were forced to leave the country because Moscow had decided to limit the number of German officials. So today's decision is the next logical step in this ongoing escalation process.
OK. Nina, does either side, as far as you can tell, is either side minded to ease tensions?
Well, Phil, tit-for-tat moves are not that unusual in diplomatic relations. So you expel my diplomat, I expel yours, but usually the number is the same and the category is the same. And this, however, is something that goes far beyond diplomacy. It targets civil society as well, and it does sever ties between, say, language teachers and ordinary Russians. And when it comes to the big picture, if you look at what the German government is doing, the German Chancellor has announced that he would talk to Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, as soon as there is a new reason to do that. And that means as soon as the German government sees that Putin could show some kind of willingness to move troops out of Ukraine again. And that doesn't appear to be the case. So the short answer is, at the moment, there is no attempt to de-escalate on leaders' level. And the number of potential corridors for de-escalation on other levels has shrunk even further today.
OK, so Yuri, do you expect any further reaction from Russia to this move?
Well, I haven't heard an immediate response, but the Russian Foreign Ministry has announced it will issue a statement soon. But regardless what the reaction from Moscow will be, Phil, the closure of the consulates will primarily affect ordinary people who need access to consular services. Germans in Russia or Russians in Germany, people go to the consulate to apply for visas, get marriage certificates, birth certificates, passports, and so on. So the consulates are not political institutions, but administrative bodies that solve the problems of citizens abroad. The work of these administrative bodies will be slower and more difficult now, and that means that in both Russia and in Germany, normal people on the ground will suffer because of the symbolic actions taken by the governments.
Thank you for that, Yuri. Yuri Reshetto in Riga and Nina Haase here in Berlin. Thank you both.